July 20th, 1964. Midnight. The heat rising from the pavement was thick enough to choke on, but the air in Harlem was electric, sharp with the smell of smoke and raw, uncontained rage. The sound wasn't sirens. It was 1,000 feet pounding the ground, a chaotic rhythm of fury aimed straight at property lines drawn in white ink. The riots had begun in earnest, a spontaneous combustion fueled by years of neglect and immediate outrage. Every storefront, every window, every signpost that wasn't unambiguously black-owned was a target, a spark waiting for the match. This was the moment the established balance of power could shatter into glass and ash. Ellsworth Johnson, Bumpy, stood silhouetted against the broken lights spilling from his command post, located safely above the screaming chaos. He didn't shout orders. He spoke low, every word a carefully placed block of concrete. His soldiers, not simple street thugs, but disciplined men loyal to the king, waited for the final command. They knew the assignment, the impossible contract delivered years ago by Charlie Luciano himself, whispered across prison bars and ratified in blood. The outfit owned pieces of Harlem, specific loan shark operations, vital numbers parlors, the real estate holding the larger rackets together. If those designated properties burned, Bumpy's treaty, Bumpy's protection, Bumpy's reign, was forfeit. This wasn't a time for moral alignment. It was a time for cold, calculating sovereignty. The men moved out, not to quell the overall violence, but strictly to draw invisible lines of demarcation. They weren't protecting white men. They were protecting the agreement that made Bumpy the undisputed lord of the numbers game. The furious crowds were approaching the designated storefronts, places where Italian cash flowed freely in and out of the local economy. Bumpy's enforcers placed themselves silently on the stoops and corners. They wore the colors of the street, but they carried the authority of the throne. Anyone who dared touch the few, marked businesses, marked by an unseen symbol of immunity negotiated at the highest level, was met not by the police, but by the immediate, brutal opposition of Harlem itself. It was a quick, sharp lesson on who dictated the rules of engagement, even during anarchy. Bumpy had risked his life, his reputation, and the temporary loyalty of the community he claimed to represent, all for the sake of that ancient handshake with the Italians. Why? Because the payoff wasn't merely survival. It was the sacred promise. Luciano had guaranteed him uncontested control of the lucrative black numbers game, the keys to an empire built on the very streets now threatening to consume him. Bumpy wasn't guarding physical buildings. He was guarding the foundational myth of his power, the undeniable fact that Bumpy Johnson always delivers, even when the city is engulfed in flames. This protection was the final payment on a debt that guaranteed his crown for eternity. He watched the approaching fire glow, a slight, predatory smile curling on his lips. Let them burn everything else down to the foundation. These specific assets were untouchable. 1943, August 1st. The city now smelled of sulfur and righteous desperation, a thick blanket of smoke rolling down Lenox Avenue that felt like judgment. This was not the typical neighborhood shakedown Bumpy was accustomed to controlling. This was the Harlem Riot, an explosion of generational suffering finally aimed at the exploiters. The crowds were not targeting their own. They were focused, maniacal, striking at the white-owned businesses, the loan shark operations, the storefronts that bled the community dry. And almost every one of those key spots was connected, directly or indirectly, to the 5 families down south. This was the exact danger Bumpy had been warned about, the risk Luciano had charged him to nullify. The police were useless now, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of fury, focused only on containing the boundary lines, unwilling to wade into the chaos just to save a few Italian gambling dens or drug drops. Bumpy stood alone as the only barrier between the surging tide of Harlem's rage and the untouchable assets he had sworn to protect. The irony was a raw, aching burden. The king of Harlem, risking his skin and his reputation to protect the very structures that perpetuated the oppression of his people. But this was the cost of his crown. The stakes were astronomical, transcending mere property damage. If those assets burned, if the ledgers were destroyed, if the cash vaults were looted, Luciano would not blame the riots. He would blame Johnson. Failure here meant instant obsolescence, the revocation of the truce, the end of the monopoly, and likely, a bullet faster than any judge could pronounce a sentence. That deal, signed years ago with Lucky Luciano, guaranteeing Bumpy total autonomy over the black rackets and protection from federal interference, was the foundational myth of his empire. It was built on the promise that Harlem was safe territory, a zone where Italian investment could thrive under black protection. If Bumpy failed to extinguish this storm, he would instantly be revealed as a fraud to the Italian mob, and worse, a traitor to the very community whose pride and fury he was trying to manage. He had to ensure the mob assets survived this inferno without the people understanding exactly what he was saving. His legend demanded he succeed. His life demanded he never let the kingmaker regret their agreement. Every building saved, every vault untouched, was proof that Bumpy Johnson was not just a king in Harlem, but a necessary pillar in the national structure of organized crime, an untouchable commodity worth more than the city burning around him. It was late October 1948. The cleanup operations from the summer upheaval had long finished, and the scent of burned wreckage was replaced by the stale musk of easy money being counted in backrooms all across Manhattan. Bumpy Johnson had proven his value too perfectly. His success was now his liability. He had saved the policy banks, the liquor caches, and the entire structure of the Italian operation north of 110th Street during the riots, solidifying his bond with Luciano's remnants. But where? The old guard saw utility and respect. The new generation of bosses saw vulnerability. They watched Bumpy's unchallenged authority and mistook silence for stagnation. They had allowed Bumpy his tax, his sovereign tribute, but the whispers turned into low-frequency movements against the kingdom's borders. The challenge did not come through violence. It came through arithmetic. They started clipping percentages, subtle shifts in policy payouts in specific blocks south of 125th Street. They didn't hit the centers of his power. They struck the soft edges, the places they thought he wouldn't notice or wouldn't care enough to fight for. This was not an open declaration of war. It was a slow, calculating squeeze designed to see how much pressure the king of Harlem would tolerate before folding. They saw Bumpy, the man who walked through fire for them, as merely a glorified, expensive security guard for their northern holdings. They believed the stillness emanating from his headquarters, the long, quiet days observed by his lieutenants, was weakness. They were betting on complacency. But kings do not rage. They calculate. Bumpy sat in the back of the Lafayette, the smoke coiling like strategy around his head. He had eyes and ears in every corner, every illicit ledger copied, every boastful word repeated back to his throne that he knew the precise amount they were skimming, the names signing off on the incursions, and the exact coordinates of their creeping arrogance. He didn't just see the moves. He saw the pattern. They weren't challenging his individual power. They were challenging the core agreement, the very foundation of the East Coast criminal economy Luciano had brokered. They believed Bumpy's authority was granted by them, not earned through blood and absolute necessity. They wanted to dismantle the protective wall he had built, brick by brick, until the Harlem Kingdom was just another occupied territory. Bumpy let the pressure build. He allowed the percentage cuts to continue for 17 agonizing days, letting the thieves grow confident, letting their paper trails deepen and their greed become predictable. He was not preparing to react to a minor raid. He was preparing a demolition. He was waiting for them to take the very first, fatal step onto the consecrated, untouchable ground, the heart of what he called his own. They thought they were testing the depth of the water. Bumpy knew they were already drowning. July 30th, 1943, 11:30 p.m. Harlem was a pressurized boiler, the heat of the summer amplifying the tension building for days. But in the low-ceilinged backroom of the Paradise Club, the temperature was a steady, dry cold, regulated entirely by the man sitting at the center table. Ellsworth Johnson, Bumpy, did not move. He allowed the sweat to pool on the brow of Preacher Jones, the rival fool who thought 17 days of clever siphoning had somehow weakened the king of Harlem. Jones stood trembling slightly, flanked by his half-dozen runners who had successfully, or so they believed, diverted over $15,000 from the daily numbers draw. Jones cleared his throat, expecting demands, a negotiation, maybe even the flash of a pistol. Bumpy simply observed him, his hands resting flat on the table, still, unnervingly still. The moment stretched, thick and suffocating. Jones finally, foolishly, broke the silence, raising his chin. "We have the numbers, Johnson. You want them back? We talk terms." Bumpy's reply was delivered in a voice so low it demanded absolute silence just to hear. "You took $12,000, he corrected, the number precise, mathematical, entirely devoid of emotion. Jones snorted a nervous laugh, confirming his mistake. "It was 15, Bumpy. Don't play games. That was the instant of utter surrender, the moment Bumpy had been patiently curating. 15,000 is what you tallied, Jones," Bumpy clarified, his eyes sharp and merciless. "But the other 3,000? That was the marker I placed on the table for you to see, the breadcrumb trail I laid out on day one, designed to make you overconfident, to make you bold enough to sign your own name." Bumpy tapped a stack of crisp, clean ledgers laid meticulously beside him, ledgers Jones recognized as his own operations accounting. "You didn't steal my manifests, Jones. You signed and confirmed the decoy ledgers I introduced into circulation just 4 days into your little revolt. The $15,000 you secured, you didn't steal it from me. You meticulously documented where it went, confirming every single transaction for my files, confirming you were running an internal theft ring for 17 days right up until this hour. You didn't come here to negotiate a truce. You came here to deliver a confession." The silence that followed was the sound of a small man's empire collapsing. Jones hadn't just been outmaneuvered. He had been utilized, his greed turned into Bumpy's internal audit system. He had thought he was a player, but Bumpy had reduced him to a highly effective, deeply humiliated clerk. Bumpy didn't bother to have him killed. Death was too quick, too merciful. Jones was stripped of his crew, stripped of his dignity, and left exposed to the streets as the fool who tried to steal a crown and ended up polishing the king's boots. The move solidified Bumpy's position. He didn't just win wars. He structured the defeats of his enemies to reinforce his own infrastructure, proving that the true power in Harlem was not brute force, but flawless, meticulous foresight, the kind of foresight Luciano himself would soon richly reward. The defeat of Jones was the closing of one chapter, but history rarely offered silence, only a pause between explosions. Early March 1935. Harlem was not just a neighborhood. It was a simmering pressure cooker, the pressure built from decades of neglect and disrespect finally reaching critical mass. Tensions over jobs, dignity, and injustice boiled over, shattering the fragile glass of racial calm. The people were looking for targets, for symbols of the white power structure that exploited them. And the easiest targets were the policy drops, the loan sharks, the small storefronts, the points of contact controlled by the white man's mafia. Charles "Lucky" Luciano, consolidating his power across Manhattan, had his lines of credit, his money runners, his essential infrastructure scattered across Bumpy streets. These Italian interests were suddenly exposed, vulnerable targets in a whirlwind of righteous rage. Bumpy Johnson watched the chaos erupt, not from a distance, but from the center of the storm. He understood the depth of the rage. He also understood the geometry of power, a geometry infinitely more important than the temporary satisfaction of revenge. Protecting the street-level interests of the Commission was not altruism. It was strategic capital preservation, the ultimate long-term investment. Bumpy moved fast, a dark phantom commanding loyalty and discipline where police sirens could not penetrate. His lieutenants, men loyal to the system he had built, formed an impermeable cordon. Italian collectors, the money haulers, and the crucial nerve centers of the numbers racket. They were insulated, shielded behind the infrastructure of Bumpy's own organization. He ensured that the only things burning were the establishments that had refused to pay him tribute, or the meaningless, disposable structures. Bumpy was shielding the crown jewels of the New York mob right in the heart of the rebellion. When the dust settled, when the sirens faded and the arrests ceased, the ledger was devastatingly clear to the Commission. Luciano's operations in Harlem were the only ones that survived intact, largely untouched by the fury. The protection was absolute. This was the moment the reward was earned, the favor so profound it transcended mere cash. Luciano, the undisputed boss, did not offer a small tribute or a handshake. He offered the structure itself. The Commission officially recognized Bumpy Johnson as the de facto king of Harlem, granted him complete and unfettered autonomy over the policy and dope rackets north of 110th Street. No more white intermediaries. Bumpy became the direct conduit, the recognized authority who reported only to the highest echelons of the New York system. The community reaction was a complex silence of respect. They knew who kept the peace. They knew who ensured Harlem ran smoothly, regardless of who sat in City Hall. He was ruthless, yes, but he was there ruthless, the only stable authority in a shifting, dangerous world. This single, audacious act, protecting the enemy during a civil uprising, cemented his empire, ensuring that his reign was not just tolerated by the outsiders, but structurally essential, a foundation built not on blood, but on an eternal debt owed by the Supreme Court of organized crime. The crown was finally and firmly upon his head. Respect. It is the only currency that matters in the shadows, and Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson never begged for it. He extracted it, meticulously, like a surgeon removes a necessary organ. The protection Bumpy offered the Italian operations in Harlem during that boiling summer uprising was not merely a favor. It was the purchase of an unpayable debt, a debt that eclipsed any street tribute or protection racket ever conceived. Bumpy understood the fundamental geometry of true power, the lesson that Luciano himself, the quiet architect of the syndicate, took notes on. You do not secure your position by eliminating all threats, but by becoming utterly necessary to the continued operation of your most dangerous rivals. Luciano and the Commission did not fear Bumpy's gun. They feared the vacuum his disappearance would create, the uncontrollable chaos that only his iron hand kept locked away. This calculated genius guaranteed his permanence. He wasn't merely tolerated by the mafia. He was structurally essential, a piece of the foundation that could not be moved without collapsing the entire structure. The crown Bumpy now wore was not made of gold, but of strategic immunity, an invisible shield forged from the realization that his continued reign was more profitable than his immediate assassination. He stood as the ultimate paradox, the autonomous king of a black community, thriving because he was the necessary guardian of the white enemy's assets. He didn't just survive in the underworld. He redefined its rules, creating an empire built not on territory claimed, but on debts owed. This was the silent, eternal guarantee. Harlem was Bumpy's, not because he killed everyone who challenged him, but because he engineered a world where the most powerful men alive needed him to stay alive. They gave him the respect of the untouchable because disrespecting Bumpy meant inviting the fury of the street back onto their own doorstep, a self-destructive action no mob boss would risk. Look closely at the history of the king. He taught us that true power is not forcing compliance, but making your existence the most valuable resource available. He taught us that the man who controls the chaos controls the kings who fear it. He was more than a gangster. He was a strategic master, a legend who turned civil unrest into sovereign power. The king has shown his final hand. The debt is paid. The story of how a sharecropper's son became a legend in the greatest city in the world is nearly complete. But you, the listener, have you paid your respects? If you learned the ultimate lesson of power, if you truly appreciate how the king of Harlem secured his throne, then smash the like button now. Hit subscribe and ring that notification bell, because history like this is never finished, and we still have secrets of the archives to reveal. Drop a comment below and tell me, was Bumpy Johnson the most strategic mind in the history of American crime? Let the debate begin.